Hello again, it's Noob, and in this video I want to share with you some advanced picking techniques which will allow you to pick disc detainer locks that can center tension using a top tensioning disc detainer tool like this Sparrow's pick. Now, this doesn't work with every lock, but it works on more than you think. If any of those words didn't make any sense to you at all, let's first consider a disc detainer lock, how they work in the first place. Okay, so we have a number of discs in the lock stacked up in a disc pack, and we have at the other side a sidebar which normally rests in between the core and the body, and without the key in the correct position the whole thing won't turn because the sidebar is trapped between the body and the lock. When you rotate the discs to a specific amount, as determined by the cuts on the key, and you can see the cuts on the key rotate the disc to a certain amount, there'll be a groove on the alternative side of the disc, and here is one of those discs with that groove, which when all the discs are fully aligned by the correct degree of rotation, that sidebar will be able to drop down into that line of grooves on the underside of the discs and essentially allow the core to turn and the lock to open. So disc detainer locks can be tensioned without the key, so you can pick them either at the top, the middle, or the bottom depending on the bitting. This particular lock here you can see has 0 cuts, and what I mean by 0 cuts is, look at the its other key, 0 cuts, ones which are flat, they're not cut into on the key at the back, the middle, and at the top. That means this particular lock, and again it depends entirely on the bitting of the key, can actually be tensioned from the rear, from the middle, and from the top. You can see where the discs have these little up posts. The ones which are aligned to a 0 cut can push against the core of the lock itself, and that'll put tension against the discs from the sidebar as it's being pushed out of its groove in the lock. So like I said, depending on where that 0 cut is, that depends on where you can tension your lock. Very cool. So rear tensioning, you'll see from the side, if I put a rear tensioning tip down this keyway, you can see that I can reach that 0 cut disc right in the rear. If I use a front tensioning tool and pop it in, you can see that I can reach the, just pop it in, yep, you can see that I can reach the first discs. But if I don't have a rear tensioning tool and only have a front tensioning tool, but I can't tension off the front discs because they're not 0 cuts, then what do I do? So here in front of you are 3 locks which technically can't be front tensioned due to the bitting. The first disc is not 0 cut. I'll show you that in a minute. This lock here is the odd one out because this is the only one which cannot be front tensioned or rear tensioned. It must be center tensioned. These are rare, but I'll just show you this anyway. Here is the key, and you might think that this is a 0 cut at the tip and that you could use a rear tensioning disc detainer tool with a tip like this, but actually just not true. That's just a space at the end of the lock. This is the cut for the first disc. You might think that this here is a 0 cut. Actually, no, it's not. This is the first disc cut here. You might think that you might be able to do one of the techniques I'm going to show you where you can tension off this disc anyway, and I've got to tell you, you can't. You get 0 feedback. It's just that type of lock, you get 0 feedback that way. The only disc that you can tension off is this one here, and the only way therefore to pick this lock is using a tool which allows you to center tension and is incredibly tough to use, like this, where you alternate between the tips being either the picking tip or the tension tip. What do I mean? Well, what you do is you insert the tool into the lock, you would put the tip to the back, and tension using the one closest to you. Then you pick your way through using the other tip until you met up with the disc that the first tip is on. Then you'd swap over and continue picking through the lock with the what was the tension tip and it's now the picking tip. The picking tip became the tension tip. That swap over and that picking, very, very tricky indeed. But like I said, that is quite rare, quite an anomaly where you can't either rear or front tension. Okay, so let's have a look at these two locks. Well, this lock, you can rear tension, but as I said, not everybody has a rear tension tool. You'll also notice it's got two cuts here, which are also zero cut, which means that you could center tension it, but not everybody has a tool which you can center tension. This here is the second cut, and this is the first cut, so you might think you'd be able to top tension here, but if I show you the lock, this top disc is actually a free spinning disc. It just goes around and around, so you couldn't tension off that disc. It is gated, however, so this particular spinner is gated, which means it must be set to the right position, but you just can't tension off it. It's really the first disc, but you just can't tension off the first disc. So this lock, you'd have to use a technique where you would tension off the second disc, but then use the tension tool to pick the second and the first disc before you get it open. In this lock, which again is cut away, you'll see that the first disc is this one here. And technically you can center tension because you do have a zero cut here, and you can possibly rear tension because you've got a zero cut here. But like I said, if we don't have a rear tensioning tool or a center tensioning tool, your only option is to tension off the first disc. It does have a spinner, but it's not gated. This is just an anti-drill spinner. It doesn't even have a profile cut on it. It just goes round and round. So technically you'd be the first disc that you'd be in the lock is the first actual disc you need to pick, and you can tension off that. So I'm going to show you now how you can use your front tensioning tool to pick off the first disc, regardless of the fact that it's not a zero cut, and then swap over your tension to hold against the zero cut in the center of the lock, and then use the tip to pick the first disc backwards. Then I'll show you a more advanced technique where you do the same thing, but you'd use the tip to pick both the first and second disc. So I've used this front tensioning tool to pick my way through all of these discs in this lock. Let's remind ourselves of the key and what I'm actually tensioning against. I'm actually tensioning against this disc. It's not zero cut. I'll have to actually tension against this disc to make absolutely certain that I can hold onto that disc, which is a zero cut, put tension against the core, then rotate the pick tip backwards to set this disc, and then we should find that the whole thing opens. Well, let's give it a go. So just going to put tension back on the lock, and then I'm going to make sure that I've got all my discs. So you can see that I'm just manipulating the last discs. Just make sure that everything's fully aligned, and I can't pick anything else, I don't think. Good. So now what I'm going to do is find the zero disc, which is this one. Can you see it moving? It's zero disc because I can't move it any further than that, and that is going to put tension on the core. I hold on to it. Oh, I just slipped off. Hold on to it. Just going to move this back a bit so you can see it properly. Then I'm going to turn this back on the first disc, and once it's in the true gate, you can just keep turning your picking tip around like that, and the whole lock will open. So you might have seen some YouTube pickers do this on a number of bike D-locks, which normally are rear tensioning, but they do have a zero disc somewhere in the middle. They'll use a front tensioning tool like this to tension against the wrong disc, swap tension over to a zero disc in the center of the lock, using the pick tip. So they're just moving it to that, tensioning off it, and then they'll turn the pick tool backwards and pick that first disc. Okay, so we have the girder now, and remember the first disc position, which is here, is zero cut, but it's also free spinning. So you need to set this disc, and you also need to set the second disc, which is one I'm tensioning off. But to do that, we actually need to get tension on the third disc down. So currently I'm somewhere between the second and third disc, so I need to find that third disc and tension off it. Then we need to rotate the tensioning tip back until we feel that we're in the true gate. And I would say that that is somewhere around there. It's very loose. Then what we need to do is pull the whole thing back out a bit and then rotate the spinner. Oh, I just came off that zero disc. Rotate the spinner only until it's in its gate. There we go. And I think we have an open. Yes, we do. And I can just show you the back of the lock. So there we go. So this is actually tensioning not off the first disc, but the second disc, and then using the picking tip. So we're tensioning off not the first disc, but the second disc. Then we use the picking tip to tension off any of the zero cuts. It doesn't matter which one. I chose the third one. And then we rotate the pick back and then back again to set the last disc, or back and then forwards as it happens. This doesn't work on every lock of this type. It all depends on the tolerances of the lock. Sometimes you'll find that spinner pushes the sidebar out so much you don't get any feedback on the second disc at all. Although you can use a bit of trial and error. There are only so many positions in these locks. So as long as you know that the top bitting is always going to be one of two positions, you could trial and error this one. Might need to go back and forth 10-15 times, but you will get there. It does take the skill out of the pick, but you can do it. So there you go. Those are some advanced techniques in which you can use a front tensioning tool on some locks, all depends on the tolerances, to tension off the first or second disc to begin with, and then use the tip to tension off the center of the lock and the pick tip to pick either the first and or second disc to get the lock open. So pretty advanced techniques, but certainly ones you should explore. It really helps if you know the inner workings of your lock. If you've gutted it first, you know how it works, whether the first disc is indeed a free spinning gated disc or whether it's just a free spinning anti-drill disc, etc, etc. It really helps to know what you're picking before you start picking. It certainly helps a lot. Anyway, hope you found that interesting, and I'll see you all next time.